Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this Gaming Today video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to be starting things out with Intel, as the company addresses some of our questions concerning the 5GHz 28-core processor demonstration at Computex 2018. Hint, they forgot to tell us that it was overclocked. That, plus many other startling revelations we will be going through in this very video. Then good news from Camp AMD. The company are doubling its commitments to graphics cards, specifically on annual releases of new silicon. This means, at least in theory, AMD are going to have new products, so we won't see a Polaris-based situation again for a while, and B, that's obviously good for competition in the marketplace. So we'll be discussing exactly what that's probably going to look like and how AMD are going to be achieving that. And then finally, slightly bad news for owners of modern Geforce graphics cards, specifically DisplayPort bugs. There is a DisplayPort in modern Nvidia Geforce graphics cards, and it is only fixable via a BIOS update. That's right, a simple driver update will not address these issues. Speaking of addressing issues, let's move over to Intel. I think it's fair to say that Intel have been feeling the pressure recently in the HEDT market. Threadripper was kind of out the left field. No one really expected it. Even AMD themselves admitted that it actually started out as a passion project. They had not originally intended to do it. It was going to be the mainstream with the Ryzen processors and, of course, EPYC for servers, but they had never actually considered releasing a HEDT product. But that changed when folks at the company were working on Threadripper in their spare time, and well, the rest is history. Intel, to their credit, did get the core advantage with the X299 platform, the 7980XE, but it was very expensive, about double the price of the 16-core 32-thread Threadripper. But still, if you're looking to be on top of the mountain, which obviously is the real reason, well, one of the real reasons for these products to exist, most people just can't afford $2,000 US, for example, on a processor, let alone the rest of the hardware, unless, you know, they can really justify it with production or what have you. Well, yeah, Intel did get one up there. But, of course, times change. Products get refreshed and new ones get released. And we all know that Computex 2018 was going to be a very interesting set of releases. AMD had been hyping and hyping and hyping. But let's face it, AMD probably have a few moles, or at least a few murmurs, which head over to Intel. And Intel most likely knew that, yes, AMD were planning to double the core count, double the thread count from 16 to 32, and from 32 to 64 of cores and threads respectively for the next generation Threadrippers, which is very impressive. And more to the point, you can essentially do that on your same motherboard. Yes, there are some issues that I mentioned with power delivery, and you know, you may not be able to overclock it, you know, quite as high maybe as if you bought one of the refresh boards and a few other bits and pieces, but that's not really the point, is it? It's still bloody impressive. So what are you going to do with your Intel? Well, of course they need to demonstrate something that's going to take some of the eyes off of AMD. Of course, AMD had the core advantage. 28 is smaller than 32, but what Intel can do is really double down on the commitment for clock speed, which is definitely one area, and this is undoubtable, that Intel have had an advantage over AMD, and they continue to do so. Coffee Lake over even even Zen Plus chips. Yes, Coffee Lake is faster. So what they did do was demonstrate a 28-core processor running at 5GHz. Of course, during the demonstration, it absolutely obliterated Cinebench, getting over 7,300 points. Not really surprising when you just consider the sheer number of threads and cores that are just absolutely roasting this damn demonstration alive. But there were still questions. The wording at the conference made it seem like this was a product that was being made for us, for regular consumers. Yes, of course, in a niche of a niche. After all, it is most likely going to be expensive. I don't think anyone expected this thing to cost like $500 and be a slightly more expensive version than the 8700K, but still, we were expecting it to be essentially some version of a consumer chip, or perhaps a server chip which is being repurposed, and currently an early engineering sample which is more of a proof of concept, which would, you know, still been okay. After all, Threadripper and EPYC are very similar in terms of architecture. It's not that much difference, right? So that was all fine with me. After all, Skylake X, Cascade Lake, you know, most of the cores and stuff remain very similar. And we had heard quite early on that the motherboards we'd been seeing essentially were modified server boards. But things started to become a bit suspicious quite early on. After the initial round of reporting, including from us, had happened, we started to hear murmurs that Intel had been a bit sneaky with the cooling used. But what the cooling was is a bit of a mystery. After all, there was a couple of conflicting reports, and some of the photos we'd seen did seem to appear that it was just some type of water cooling loop, which wasn't out of the question and out of realms of normality. After all, we weren't expecting this thing to just be cooled by a simple air cooler, at least at that type of clock speed. So, okay, benefit of the doubt still. But these questions continued and continued and continued, and eventually, now Intel have responded. Oh dear. Yeah. There's a number of things, and we'll be going in depth in them in just a moment. But a quick overview. First of all, the processor was actually being overclocked to 5 GHz, and essentially the presenter had, for lack of a better word, forgotten to comment on this during the presentation, which is a pretty big thing to forget. Like, if he'd have slightly misspoke on the power draw, let's say, I'm just using the example power draw because Intel have not given that information, but we can presume it's going to be over 250, 270 watts. But let's assume he said it was 250 watts and it was actually 260. That's possible. You can misread a teleprompter, you can, you know, have a figure stuck in your head. If you think that the core volt is I'm just using an example, 1.35 volts, but it's actually 1.37 volts, you can forget, you know, you can easily get that stuff mixed up. And yes, it's a screw up, but it's not like, by the way, this is actually severely overclocked. The second factor, and this is perhaps the big one, is that they did not actually mention the architecture here. Now, from the wording, it would appear that Intel are pretty much admitting that this is Skylake based. This is not Cascade Lake, which was what was actually you could be led to believe by simply watching the demonstration. After all, he was discussing about bringing a new processor to us as customers, which was, for lack of a better word, still under development. And given what we know about Cascade Lake X's timing, it wasn't an unreasonable assumption to say, oh, look, it's going to be based on the new architecture. And yes, we can probably presume that there is definitely some tweaking going on here and there. And yes, it's early silicon, so maybe it's got a slight tweak on the clock speed, but no one, you know, what was going on.
The presentation had been rather light on details, but Gregory Bryant had told us that the CPU was supposed to come out sometime during Q4. According to an Intel representative speaking with AnandTech, the presenter on stage was actually supposed to clarify that the system was indeed overclocked, but for whatever reason, that specific wording was not stated as it had actually been prepared for the conference. Intel had supposedly taken on board the feedback from AnandTech and others in the tech community regarding more discussion around the actual system itself as well as the CPU, but we can only wait and see if this is actually the case in the future. Intel also confirmed that a water chiller was used, and they had decided not to showcase the cooling on stage due to, quote, time constraints. I have to admit that I'm not particularly sold on this myself. After all, it's only going to take, what, 20-30 seconds to at least explain that it's using a water chiller? Even if they don't go into huge details, they could have just mentioned it. Here, let me help you, Intel, for next time. We are using a water chiller for this pre-production processor, and are currently overclocking the CPU to 5 GHz, but final clock speeds, operating temperatures and TDP is something we're working on, and we'll have more information for you guys over the next coming months. That's all I needed to say. Any derivative of that. Unfortunately, in the discussion with AnandTech, Intel still did not give information on the actual platform. What is pretty clear is just looking at the motherboard, it's some LGA3647, and I don't have any particular issues with that. per se, although some people are jumping up and down on it. It's like, yeah, Epic and Threadripper are very similar to one another, so if they'd have simply said, hey, this is currently working on a server socket and we're still tweaking it for those who might want such a solution as a workstation or whatever, then I would have been absolutely okay with that. I had no qualms at all. It would have simply said that, well, yeah, it's a platform that they're still working on, and right now they're just kind of tinkering with it, which is something that we see all the time in technology. I mean, the original Xbox, when it was being developed, was pretty much just multiple laptops, for the love of goodness, so that's something I could have been okay with. Intel would only confirm that the 28-core processor is built on 14nm. They would not actually specify the type of 14nm node, so of course there's A, rules out 10nm, and B, from what we can kind of figure right now, it's looking like it's going to be some Skylake X processor. My personal opinion, and the opinion shared by a lot of individuals, is that it's some Xeon Platinum or possibly an engineering sample processor which is very similar to those designs. So we don't 100% know whether it's Cascade Lake or Skylake, but my personal opinion is it's much more likely to be Skylake based. Intel were also very cagey when it came to power consumption. The Xeon Platinum 8180, which is a possible candidate for this processor to be based on, has a TDP of 205 watts. But that is only at the base frequency. The base frequency is 2.5 GHz and turbos up to 3.8 GHz. So do bear in mind that the LGA 3647 platform has a reference design for 265 watts. So unfortunately, genuine and accurate analysis here is going to be very tricky. You could look at what some in the community have been stating, that they've roughly been hitting 1000 watt power draw for the 7980XD if it runs at 4.9 GHz, but we could be seeing a different process that this is created on. Although it's unlikely, it's possible. We don't exactly know the chip that's running here. The only couple of possible clues we have is that the water chiller itself was capable of about 1770 watts of cooling. And according to Anantech, the system was using a 1600 watt power supply with a low power graphics card. You can actually see the graphics card in the Cinebench demonstration, and yeah, it doesn't really consume too much energy, but that doesn't really mean too much. After all, they weren't running GPU tests, but it's certainly at the very least a clue. Look, I'm not going to come down on Intel for demonstrating the processor. I don't have any issues with them demonstrating it. What I have issues with is the way that it was handled. What I fail to understand is how someone on the stage or someone else did not notice that the presenter had forgotten to mention that the system had been overclocked, and how someone else just didn't pick the ball up and said, hey, you know, shouldn't we mention this? And it completely and utterly baffles me that they did not feel that they had time when, you know, it's going to take 30 seconds at best to go over the basic gists of the cooler. We're not asking for them to go over every single detail. We're not asking for them to review it on stage. All I was kind of expecting was some type of confirmation. Currently, well, the only real details we have from Intel right now is that it will not be 5 GHz at stock, but the processor is still coming out in Q4 of this year.
So what are my thoughts on this? Well, in the beginning of this new segment, I did say that I think Intel felt the pressure with Threadripper, and I maintain that. I think that, to a degree, this was a publicity stunt, and I think it probably went wrong quite badly for Intel in the long run. Now, whether you feel this is malicious, and they had forgot on purpose, or whether you think it was just a genuine screw-up after all, the person's under pressure, he's on the stage and all of this stuff, that's up to you. But either way, the blowback against Intel has been very, 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 very undeniable. And if anything, it's just helping AMD. Threadripper 2000 series is not without faults, as we mentioned, the fact it's only got a quad channel memory controller, and the fact that the two additional CPU dies don't have direct access to memory. That could hurt the processor without question. And in high bandwidth or latency sensitive applications, yeah, you might notice that it doesn't quite on certain cores it does slightly fall behind. But you know what? For the pricing, and well, we still have to figure out what the prices, of course, of the next generation Threadrippers are, but I'm guessing it's going to be fairly competitive if I know anything about AMD. So, for Intel, hopefully, this is going to be one of those lessons where they learn from it and they are much better at delivering exactly what we're going to be looking at on the stage versus what the actual retail product is going to be. And hopefully they're going to be much better at actually explaining their demonstration in a much better way, because the short-term boost in publicity is not worth the harm it has created in the long run. Well, here's hoping anyway. When it comes to the graphics card market, it's undoubtable that it has been extremely stagnant recently. We've had the GTX 10 series now for just about 2 years, slightly more than that. And other than some good news in that, well, prices have come down a little bit because miners are no longer buying so many GPUs because they're just, well, waiting for ASICs, it's been very samey. The GTX 1080, the GTX 1060, the RX 580, the Vega cards, blah blah blah. There just hasn't been that much to ignite excitement. While gamers wait for the GTX 11 series or 20 series or whatever the hell it's going to be called series, AMD have certainly lost some mindshare with gamers, and this is something that he does admit in a recent roundtable discussion which PC World managed to snag. However, that's not to say that all is doom and gloom. AMD are looking to release more graphics cards more frequently. In other words, have annual graphics card releases.
So according to PC World and David Wang, we could be seeing new annual releases take the shape of either completely new architectures, process changes, incremental architecture changes, or anything in between. The most easy, of course, of these to explain is a new architecture. Well, that would be the equivalent of Pascal versus Maxwell, or Vega compared to Polaris. And generally, different architectures equals a rather large shift in design for the company. Now this can be kind of handy because obviously games developers are working on new engines, they're working on new projects all the time, new technology, and so as developers, as hardware manufacturers, and of course companies such as Microsoft with DirectX 12 and Kronos Group with Vulkan all communicate and discuss with one another what they're actually looking for in the next technology. This allows the GPU vendors to, at least in theory, design hardware which will better able to leverage that technology. As a side note, we did actually cover a supposed leak concerning AMD's upcoming GPU architecture, which is a Super SIMD design. So if you want a full analysis of that, I'll try to remember to link it in the video description, or you can simply search for it on the channel. Process changes are also pretty obvious to explain, but shifting from, say, 14 to 12nm, or in AMD's case it appears that they're aggressively pursuing 7nm, and then making other smaller incremental changes to those processors, allows of course the GPU or what have you to run at higher clock speeds. We can perhaps see improved power consumption, and those can certainly be very instrumental in improving performance. After all, if you can reduce the power consumption and heat of a GPU by even 5 or 10 degrees, in theory it would be better able to continue to keep higher boost clocks, which naturally would mean higher performance. And finally, we could see the more traditional thing, which is a simple refresh. A refresh could be just small incremental hardware changes, so it could be, for example, a slightly wider bus width on the memory, it could be higher core/memory clocks, it could be tweaks to the actual GPU architecture itself which fix slight flaws in the original design. For example, it's possible that if developers and AMD actually continue to work with the hardware and run profilers to see where issues are with the performance, they might say, oh look, if we increase the cache size here, or we implement better color compression there, or whatever, perhaps it would drastically improve performance. And when I say drastically, of course we're not saying double the performance, but 10 or 15% on top of, let's say, a 10 or 15% bump in core clock speed and perhaps higher memory bandwidth as well. And it's certainly something that would entice gamers who had, let's say, a RX 570 to jump to the new generation. Of course, how long it actually takes AMD to implement these changes, I just don't really know. After all, their roadmap appears to show that Vega is going to be, well, a thing, and I suppose technically that is kind of a refresh / tweak of existing architectures, and then of course we see the introduction of Navi.
So one of my thoughts on AMD doing this, well, honestly, I'm really happy. The fact of the matter is that this is only good news for us as customers, and it's of course good news for AMD as well, and I'm looking to see how Nvidia are going to be responding to this news. But ultimately, as I said, things have been very quiet on the GPU front. Let's just be very pessimistic and say that a refresh is only 10-15% improvement in clock speed on, let's say, the core, and maybe a slight improvement in memory bandwidth, and maybe some other small architecture changes. Perhaps they've done something with how ROPs are coupled to the memory, or perhaps they've done other bits and pieces to the caches, or whatever. You know, whatever improvements they've done. Perhaps that would be enough to get 20-30%, even if, let's be modest and say 20% bump in performance. That's still not bad, right? That means that, let's say, just using the current GPUs that are available, let's say that you bought the 580, or let's say you bought the 570 and then they release the 680 or whatever it ends up being called. You have a reason to upgrade. You can sell your old GPU on eBay or what have you, and perhaps get a decent price for it. Well, that's at least the theory. Come on then, AMD, let's see what happens. So bad news from Nvidia and DisplayPorts. So if you have a 900 series or a 10 series GPU, one of the updates that Nvidia did roll into those particular graphics cards is support for DisplayPorts 1.3 and 1.4. Unfortunately, newer displays seem to exhibit a problem. Essentially, you get a blank screen.
So Nvidia have actually released a tool which allows you to update the BIOS of your graphics card. It will essentially detect whether you need to perform this update, and if it does, it will uninstall your driver for you, and then it will proceed to flash the BIOS, and then this in turn fixes the issues with the DisplayPort. It'd be very easy for me to come down really hard on Nvidia here, but to their credit, the process looks pretty easy to fix it. Although it does suck that the design flaw is there. Unfortunately, no hardware is ever perfect.
Anyway, with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'm feeling a little off today, to be honest with you. I've had a bit of a, I don't know, headache and just not feeling just a little bit under the weather. But hopefully I'll be back to normal tomorrow, so apologies for just seeming a little off today. But hey, it's just one of those things, right? With all of that said, normal stuff, like, share, comment and subscribe. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.